I have to do theology for a living. I don't listen to it for fun. I've never even listened to Beer Christianity. Like, I don't.
What? That is absolutely
Very
fine.
few of our guests.
Nobody.
Nobody listens.
Nobody listens to mine either.
Welcome to Beer Christianity. My name's John T.
I'm Laura.
I'm Malky.
And with us, we also have Stephen
Backhouse. Which apparently John T calls me David Bennett for some reason. Stephen Backhouse is my name.
Excellent.
And I'm sticking to it.
He is recalcitrantly refusing to change his name for the podcast. So Stephen Backhouse it is. Stephen, you're from Tent Theology, a much more popular podcast than ours. And can you tell our listeners a little bit about what Tent Theology is, what you guys do, what you're about?
Well, so Tent Theology was a venture that I started about 4 years ago. I became a freelance theologian. I used to work for a series of theology colleges and seminaries and universities, some of which you might have even heard of. And but I got a bit tired. I got very tired, actually, of teaching theology just to professional Christians, just to people training for the ministry. And so I quit my job and I took the show on the road. And I started this thing called Tent Theology, which opens up theology spaces inside local churches or networks or worshiping communities or businesses, actually. I do stuff even in non-Christian circles, where we take theological thinking and reflection and we do it in spaces that don't normally have serious Christian thought happening in them. And we called it Tent Theology so that the idea is very deliberate. It's easy to take up, easy to put down, easy to take anywhere. We're trying to make it easy for Christians and Christian networks to think Christianly about what they do without having to go to university and seminary all the time. And then COVID happened, of course, and no longer was anyone inviting me to travel to teach them. So during the first flush of lockdown, as a way to kind of stay in touch with my subject, I'm a political theologian, which we'll talk about in a bit, but to keep in touch with my subject and also just to stay a bit sane, I started recording a Bible study series on the Gospel of Mark. I was doing a political theology series, and I sent it out to my friends and my colleagues, and I just said, look, pay what you can. We will send all the money to people whose livelihoods are affected by lockdown. And we started doing that, and it was actually really popular. It was really fun to do, and people started saying, could you make this easier to distribute? Could you put it on a platform that's actually people could read and access, not just my own website? And we started a podcast. So towards the end of lockdown, we actually started a podcast. We called it Tent Theology. And now it's me primarily. I'm a Canadian who lives in England, and I talk a lot about American politics. And so I decided to get a couple of my American friends on. So what happens is I do my thing and I talk about Trump and nationalism and patriotism and all that stuff and how Jesus is so much better than all that stuff. And then we have a little back and forward with my American friends and we sort of bounce ideas off them.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great place to jump in, really. What do we do when Christians, like we are seeing in the States, are supporting ideas that are just anathema to what we see as the values of Jesus? How are we supposed to oppose them? Are we supposed to take up arms? Are we supposed to shout at them? Are we supposed to pretend that there's something to respect in a kind of Nazi ideology? How do you think we need to do that?
Well, all right. For me personally, they don't speak into my life anymore. So I have a very simple rule, which is if you haven't openly admitted and then rejected nationalism, then you don't speak into my life. And I feel like nationalism it's kind of the canary in the bottom of the mine shaft. It's kind of like, if you're a nationalist or if you really do think that your job is on earth to make your nation the great nation again, then so much has gone wrong in your appropriation and imagination when it comes to Jesus Christ that I don't trust you. I don't trust your moral compass is broken. Your intellectual ability to think about Jesus is wrong. It's not working. So I just don't let them speak into my life anymore, which does effectively mean I don't have any American evangelicals in my life. I'm not trying to kill them. I'm not trying to fight them. I'm not trying to change their mind. They have nothing to say to me anymore. They've lost my ear. Not all Americans by any means. Some of the best, as Leonard Cohen said, America is the cradle of the best and of the worst. So some of the best voices are coming out of America, but they're the ones who they know they're living in the belly of the beast, and they know it, and they are thinking about it and finding ways to talk about it. And I find them a useful, helpful guide. But yeah, I basically I don't take them out of my life. I just quietly drop them, and they don't speak to me anymore. They don't speak into my life. They don't have permission to inform my imagination.
It is a quite pervasive problem, because people who would think of themselves as progressive and on broadly the kind of liberal or left side of things politically, speaking about Christians, particularly in the States, you encounter those who say, yeah, but obviously America is the greatest nation on earth, or they still have that underlying patriotic or nationalistic understanding of things.
They do. Yeah.
How have they missed that? Because I feel like that's not quite the case as much in other places.
Well, America hasn't invented Christian nationalism. They've just perfected it. Or they are the ones currently living it out the most. But they didn't invent it by any means. And it is not that hard to find British nationalists, Christian nationalists. I mean, we can go into it in a little bit, but I tend to think all patriotism is wrong. So even the mild patriotism that you think you feel, I think if your little heart goes pitter-patter when you see your flag flying, you have succumbed to a temptation that the earliest Christians knew was a vice.
Yeah.
And now we even normal Christians assume it's a virtue. So when I talk about nationalism, I'm not just talking about putting Jews into Holocaust ovens. I'm not talking about the most evil forms of nationalism. I'm talking about good old-fashioned patriotism.
Yeah.
Putting flags in your church, even on, Remembrance Sunday. Using the machinery of the Church of Jesus Christ to further the aims and allegiances of the state, especially when it comes to the military stuff. That is, I think, so deeply opposed to the way of Jesus Christ that it's not. It might be Christian, but it's not following the way of Jesus. And so it just has nothing to say to me. I mean, partly, I do find Americans will often say, how did we get a well-meaning, liberal, do-gooder, bleeding heart liberal Christians? How did we get to this place? How did we fall? Like, what's happened to us? How did we become so nationalistic? And I just look at them and I'm like, there has never been a time in American history when Christianity wasn't associated with American expansionism, slavery, genocide of native Indians, the appropriation of the America as God's chosen nation. There has never been a time when American Christianity has not been nationalist. It didn't fall from some heady height. It began that way, and it's just continued, and we're seeing the fruits of it now.
Do you think it has been in some ways inherited from the colonial origins of America? Because at the time, obviously, British culture was so infused with this sense of God shining on the empire, and empire being a way to spread Christianity as well. Is that what it goes down to, or is it a kind of larger or deeper Constantinian vibe?
Well, before... Look, I'm Canadian. I have a Canadian accent, but I'm also British, and I've been living in this country for longer than I ever lived in Canada. So I'm going to say us Brits. I'm going to say that.
Nice.
Us Brits aren't allowed to get too smug about Americans because, of course, when they were doing all their genocide and slavery and colonial expansion, they were British. They weren't really thinking as Americans. They were thinking as English people then, actually. So, let's not get too smug about it. And what we see is that, like I said, Americans didn't invent it. It's a very deep thing, is that Christianized nations and empires have, since there has been a Christianized empire, it has seen its expansion as part of its Christian duty. And we've seen that from Constantine onwards, right? So it's not some sort of crazy thing that just showed up 200 years ago. The British Empire did it, and they used the exact same language about themselves 200 years ago that Americans are using about themselves now. And the Russian Empire used it, and the Byzantine Empire used it, and the Roman Empire used it. And, there's something about a Christian corruption of belief that leads to nationalism, and it happens all over the place. So I'm a student of Søren Kierkegaard. So Kierkegaard is the guy. I did my doctorate on Kierkegaard's, and I used Kierkegaard to look at Christian nationalism. Okay. And one of Kierkegaard, by the way, just for your listeners, he was a Danish philosopher. He died in 1855, but he was keenly aware of the problems of Christendom. And so for him, he looked at Christendom, which is cultural Christianity, and he said, this is a lie. This is using the word Christian to refer to being born into a certain civilization, which is not what following Jesus is about. And in fact, in the New Testament, followers of Jesus were asked to come out of their civilizations. And they were put in opposition to the civilizations they were born into. And now we live in Christendom, where being a Christian means you're a better member of your civilization, or it's seen to be a positive thing. So he saw this idea of Christian nations and Christian civilizations as kind of as a lie, like an obfuscation. It's using the wrong words to trick people. So then you ask the Dane, the civilized, literate Dane in 1855, are you a Christian? And they go, well, I'm white and I speak Danish, and I'm a civilized European, so of course I'm a Christian. And Søren would say, look, that's what you've done, is you've prevented that Dane from meeting the short, sharp shock of Jesus Christ, because they think that being a Christian is as easy as being born. Yeah. And in fact, it's an offensive affront. And until you've met Jesus as a potentially offensive person, you can't be said to have faith, right? Because you haven't met Jesus. So the Christian nation idea is actually just kind of a sham and a lie that prevents people from actually becoming Christian.
And patriotism itself, because I think most people would be able to say nationalism, yeah, that's bad. But obviously being patriotic, that's fine.
Yeah.
But why is it wrong?
Well, let's go straight to the headline. Because a patriot will kill another human being for the sake of their country. Or patriots will support the killing of human beings for the sake of their country. Let's just go straight to the headline. And if during a time of war or foreign invasion, and if you were to say, I'm a patriot, but I'm a pacifist, I'm a non-violent patriot. Let's pretend the UK was being invaded by the Nazis, and you were to stand up and go, I'm a patriot, but I will not kill for my country. Other Brits would look at you and quite rightfully say, you're not a real patriot.
I mean, they get angry if you don't wear a poppy, so yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I know that there's people who like to pretend that you can be a patriot and not believe in killing for your country, but ultimately patriotism, let's be honest, it's an affection that underwrites killing, and it leads to that. And I would also say there has never been a war in all of human history that has not been fought because of patriotism.
Nice.
Every single human being that has ever been killed because of conflict has been killed because of patriotism. Either they've killed people invading their country, or they've killed others while invading. And the only reason they're invading, any invasion is happening at all, is because one group of people is saying, we must protect and enrich our resources for people who look like us and sound like us as much as possible. And whether you call that nationalism or patriotism or tribalism or factionalism, whatever you want to call it, I don't really care. That's the feeling that I'm getting at. That human impulse, which we must protect people, we must only be around people who look like us and sound like us as much as possible. And we preserve resources for those people, and we exclude people who don't look like us and don't sound like us as much as possible. And we expand our territory to include only those who are like us. That feeling, that's what I'm getting at. And sometimes we call it patriotism, and sometimes we call it nationalism. I don't really care. But that's the feeling, I think. It's deeply human. It happens everywhere. And it's one of the main things that the earliest followers of Jesus gave up. And in fact, they wrote a whole lot of the New Testament trying to dismantle that very affection that I've just described.
I wanted to ask if there's a low-level patriotism, like a kind of an affection that you would have for, the Scottish culture or my own upbringing and stuff that's familiar to me, certainly in a sporting arena, but that would be separate to a pledge of allegiance to a kind of political outfit.
Well, I mean, we've got this idea. So who you are, Malky, is a man of with a certain accent and a certain skin tone and a certain culture and a certain heritage. So like that's gone into who you are as a person. That's your nationality. It becomes nationalism when those things start to govern your actions, right? So the ism part is the ideology that comes from the reality. So I'm kind of more concerned, not about like, I'm not trying to say you can live as if you don't have an accent and a skin color and, a shared set of likes and dislikes. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is when those things, those markers of your nationality become your cornerstone or your touchstone for morality, when they become the thing in which you're like, well, I'm going to ultimately be justified in depriving other people of resources because they don't share my accent and my skin tone, or I'm going to be justified in killing other people because they don't. That's when we get into problems. So if your support of your football team led to killing, then I'd say it was a problem.
Well, it is Rangers, so
don't ask any follow-up questions.
So again, Kierkegaard's very useful here because he points out, he's like, well, actually, the New Testament, Jesus actually has a very good way of describing affection for groups of people without relationship to their nationality. And that's when he says you love your neighbor. Because he told the story of the Good Samaritan. If you think about it, it's, the young lawyer comes to Jesus and he says, who is my neighbor? And he is expecting, because in Deuteronomy, your neighbor is defined as your brother Israelite. If you go read Deuteronomy, it says, love your neighbor who is your brother Israelite, okay? So in Deuteronomy, the neighbor is defined as the one that shares your blood and your ethnic heritage. And then the young lawyer comes to Jesus and he says, you should love your neighbor. And the young man goes, oh yeah, but who is my neighbor? Fully expecting that the answer should be the one who shares your ethnic heritage. And Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, where the two people that actually share the ethnic heritage of the man in the ditch are the ones who go the other way. And the hated foreigner is the neighbor. And that story is precisely a story attacking the idea that ethnic heritage defines who you should help and who you shouldn't. It's actually an attacking a nationalist idea. And Kierkegaard, he brings this up and he says, look, it's really interesting. Like the neighbor is not defined by whether they share your ethnic heritage or skin color or accent. They are simply defined as the person whose need you've become aware of. And so, I'm thinking of my neighbor right now, like I don't share her skin tone. I don't share her accent. I don't share her religious beliefs. And yet she's my neighbor. So there's a way to identify the person I'm supposed to love without making any reference at all to any of those nationalist things, right? And this is part of Kierkegaard's way of saying, like, we are able to talk about social care and community and relationships, and it doesn't mean you're just this isolated person. It just means we're going to try and define groups without making primary reference to their nationality, which is what the early church did, which is why whenever you see anything about Jews and Gentiles eating together, they're attacking nationalism.
Yeah, so it's interesting, that idea of actually attacking. Would you say that the Christian position would be actively against nationalism as opposed to just like, oh, it's innocuous, or, if we're doing a Remembrance Sunday, we'll kind of, tone down the they died for our freedoms thing, but we'll still observe it and kind of prioritize British life because that's our country, etc., etc.
I mean, that's a classic case of... You notice how whenever I talk to patriots about military, they always like to say, They always think about soldiers who died for their freedoms. They never think about soldiers killing for their freedoms. But that's actually the job description of the soldier, is that we have an enemy and you kill them. Gee, I wonder what Jesus said we're supposed to do with our enemies. And by the way, Remembrance Sunday is we remember a whole bunch of British soldiers who died because Germans killed them. And these Germans all called themselves Christians as well, right? So the whole thing is a celebration of aims and actions that were 100% against the way of Jesus. That's the whole thing. There's no, from soup to nuts, there's nothing you can find in Remembrance Sunday that isn't actually a celebration of the defiance of the way of Jesus. And those people, those soldiers might have been brave, they might have been honorable, they were self-sacrificing, of course they were, but they were swept up in a system and they were helping to perpetuate a system that only exists in defiance to Jesus's commands. And Christians who ignore that are ignoring something really important. And I do think that that's something followers of Jesus have to start doing. They have to stop celebrating these memorial days inside their churches, because it's really just about, I mean, Stanley Hauerwas is very good on this. I don't know if you ever know any Stanley Hauerwas. He's a Texan.
I interviewed him last week. No big deal.
Oh, did you?
No big deal.
Oh, awesome. I'd love to talk to Stanley. But Stanley's very much about, like, he says, look at wars. Wars are always fought. Name a war right now. Why are we fighting? We're fighting now so that the memory of the people who died in the previous war won't be tarnished. Well, why did those people fight? Well, they fought so that the memory of the people who fought in the war before that wouldn't be tarnished. So he's like, well, so we're just fighting wars to preserve the memory of the previous war. That's all we're doing. These constant liturgies of memory are just perpetuating an endless cycle of violence.
Which is all great, but I think we do need to stop for a quick word from our sponsors.
I was thinking around the subject and I came across this actual legitimate product. Your Christianity may or may not endorse it. I'll leave it up to you to decide. But here we go. Ever read the Bible and think, this is great, but it doesn't feel very patriotic?
No.
Worry no more. Never has a version of the Bible targeted the spiritual needs of those who love our country more than the American's Patriot Bible.
No.
This extremely unique Bible shows how the history of the United States connects the people and events of the Bible to our lives in a modern world. Right, this is from the editor, the actual editor of this actual product. For the 26 million veterans of our armed forces, it'll remind them of the great country for which they fought and our appreciation for their service. For America's children and youth, it'll be a source of vital information and education. To the casual reader, this Bible will be filled with stories of our nation's heroes, past and present. And finally, to the person who's not yet fallen in love with the Bible itself, the American Patriots Bible will open the door and draw them in to partake of the most life-changing book this world has ever known. Now, would you like to hear about what the people think on Amazon?
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely, yes.
So, America loves it.
Of course.
George, 5 stars, awesome Bible. I just got my copy and I've read through it. Very well researched, inspiring stories that have never been told.
Never been told.
Never been told. Thomas, 5 stars. My husband got this. Wait a minute.
Thomas is gay.
I'd be very surprised.
The Patriot? Why?
It might be.
No, there are plenty of, gay nationalists out there. There's gay racists. There's, strange.
He says, great references and reminds us that this country was, all caps, founded by Christians.
It was founded by deists.
Jamie says, God said, if you add to the word of God, he will put plagues upon you. Oops, that's a 1 star. 1 star from Jamie there. So 87% of the reviews are 5 stars.
87.
Holy shit.
Right. Here's a 1 star review from Kathy. Some of the Psalms are missing, and also the book of Matthew. I've got to read this 2 star one. So it's a 2-star review. Because
And also the book of Matthew. Oh, man.
right, sorry, this is a 2-star review. Brenda says, because this was to be a, quote, American Patriots Bible, we are very, all caps, very disappointed to see President Barack Obama's information in there, as we do not consider him an American patriot in any sense of the word, unlike our founding fathers. The Bible, wait a minute, sorry, the Bible, other than that, is fine.
But to be clear, the American Patriots Bible is not right-wing enough for some people. That is incredible.
That's going to keep it going for ages.
Okay, and back to Stephen Backhouse. Is the reason why America is so problematic is because it is, at least in its patriotism, quite multi-ethnic and multicultural. You can be a patriot while holding another. You can be a multicultural patriot, and it's still a problem because you're defining us and them, with us being the ones who are worthy and the others aren't. It's the problem that your group is too small because it's defined in a really arbitrary way around where you were born. And is that a problem that you see? Doesn't that extend from our worship of a nuclear family, perhaps, to we've just got these extending rings of who matters and who doesn't?
Exactly.
And that's not what the church is.
Well, this is why I'm glad you point that out, because there are forms of patriotism that aren't based on race. So this is why I try and say we're talking about whatever it is you call that impulse that says I must be with people who look like me and sound like me as much as possible, because sometimes you will find multi-ethnic people in one group all shouting in worship of their flag, of course, right? But what's happening is you just look at that group, well, as much as possible means we're all going to share this language, we're going to have these values, we're going to have this flag. So, and whoever doesn't share these values, now they're the enemy, or now they're the ones who are allowed to kill. You will also find, by the way, that even like in America, so this is one of the lies of patriotism, that patriotic language is all about unity. And you see this all the time. British politicians do this all the time as well. They say, oh, we must join, we're all British, we'll have the British national story, or we'll find a patriotic story that we all can sign up to. You show me the most patriotic nation on earth. You show me the most patriotic newspaper on earth, right? And I'll show you a culture that is constantly fighting. It's constantly divisive. It's constantly finding new ways to exclude more people. Patriotism is actually an impulse that's constantly leading to more and more exclusion, because they're always trying to find tighter and tighter knots of who's real and who's authentic and who's not. And so this is why the Daily Mail is always arguing about patriotism and calling other people unpatriotic. This is why America is the most divided country on earth. And it's the most patriotic country on earth. And that's no accident. Because patriotism is, like you said, Jonty, it's kind of about trying to recreate this nuclear family idea. It's trying to find something really small and manageable, and you're always finding excuses to exclude people from your group. And Americans do that all the time under the name of patriotism. But so it's worth pointing out, Jesus was very anti-nuclear family.
Yeah. And that's what I was going to say was, it sounds like the problem is the existence of a nation to defend as something that is hard-bordered, conceptually as well as physically.
Well, this is the other thing I'd point out, is that nations need patriotism in order to exist, right? I'm not making an argument that patriotism is bad. A country needs patriots.
I mean, you kind of are.
What I'm saying is patriotism is just not a Christian option. So what happens all the time when I debate with Christian patriots is I talk about patriotism, and then they always go, yeah, but we need this. What about when our borders get invaded? What about when we're collecting taxes? What about all this? And I just look at them and go, yeah, you're right. All I'm saying is following the way of Jesus just doesn't help you run a country very well. Your arguments are all about how your country needs patriotism in order to survive. And my argument is this the way of Jesus or not? Which are two different things, right? And I don't think it's my job as a Christian to make my nation as great as it can be.
I was listening to one of your podcasts, I think one of the earlier ones, just kind of, you were talking about American state politics at the moment, and you made an interesting point about voting, which I have to say I disagreed with you. And I think you kind of said it very well, in that you said that if there isn't anyone on the ballot paper that you would think you liked or think is good for the job, that you shouldn't vote. And you did kind of say that, it's very easy for you to say that as a white cis man. But the point that interested me was that you said that rather than voting, you should, use your voice to say why you're not voting, and the kind of calling that point out. My question was, why, if you're not going to vote, why is your using your voice any different? Like, if your vote doesn't matter, why does your voice matter?
Well, first of all, I'm not actually going to die on the hill of not voting, by the way. I mean, it's been pointed out to me, and I absolutely true, that like, hey, Stephen, if you believe in non-violent resistance to evil, well, voting is one of the best non-violent ways to resist evil. So why, obviously people should vote. And like, yeah, it's fair enough, actually. I guess what I'm interested in is the possibility that sometimes not voting might be the most prophetic and best thing you can do. And sometimes it can even be the most political thing you can do. So I guess I'm trying to put a bit of thin piece of paper between the idea that voting is political and not voting is not political. And so people go, well, if you don't vote, then you lose the right to have anything to say in society. And I feel like, no, that's not actually true. That actually you can be highly politically engaged and you can be fully engaged in transformation of society, even if you don't put a little X on a piece of paper, which, let's be honest, is probably kind of pointless in the grand scheme of things. You could still be political even if you've never voted in your life. And the other thing I was trying to say to people is, like, if you decide to not vote, if you just decide that your conscience won't allow you to vote for whatever party, at the very least, make your decision vocal and public, because that's a political act, right? So I'm trying to say is, like, make that part of your public stance. Like, say to the Republicans, I'm not going to vote for you because you're abusing my faith and you are assuming too much of me. And say to the Democrats, I'm not going to vote for you because X, Y, Z. So that at the very least, your not voting is part of the conversation. I don't know. That is just one of my ways of trying to talk about it.
And is there, would you say there's a limit to that? Because, I feel like, saying that there's no point in voting in the upcoming presidential election may be slightly more controversial.
Of course there is, right? So, I mean, to be honest, I walk that back. I would vote. I'm just aware, I've heard some people so I had a guy, Justin Bronson Berenger, on my podcast, and he's a Christian anarchist. Is that right, Malky? You don't like anarchy, or does somebody didn't like the word anarchy?
Anarchist.
Yeah, but he's, but he's a really, really good guy, a really thoughtful, well thought out person, totally 100% politically engaged, like way more political than any of us are, right? And he doesn't vote because he sees it as a bit like I don't participate in Memorial Sunday kind of services. He sees it as part of the perpetuation of an unjust and bad system. So he doesn't participate in it. And, I have hats off to the guy. Like, I can understand why other people don't want to go with him, but there's no way I look at my friend Justin and go, oh, you're just a naive idiot who doesn't understand Christianity and voting. I'm like, actually, no, he understands it way better than me. And he has decided that he's not going to vote because for him, that's a perpetuation of a bad system. And then I meet other people who say, well, okay, it's a bad system, but surely it's good to get Donald Trump out as much as possible. And I'm like, well, fair enough. I can't argue with that either. So we're born in a world in which no matter what we do is the wrong thing. I think we have to also be aware of that. There is no pure answer. Whatever we do is the wrong thing. That's what original sin means. If it means anything at all, it means that.
So, in that vein, then it's very. I'm finding it hard to read Jesus as someone who cared about systemic injustice. It feels like maybe just you know, maybe there's stuff I'm missing. But it seems like at the couple of opportunities he had, he kind of shrugged his shoulders in terms of like, well, let the Roman oppressors do what they want, you know, be kind to them. And what about voting? What about taxes even? And it's kind of, it felt at a first reading for me kind of dismissive, like, oh, well, whose face is on it? You know?
Yes, I think so.
To say it the same way in a British context, it's like money's not a thing. It doesn't matter. It's got a picture of the Queen. Who cares? You know, care about this instead.
Yeah. Well, Malky, I think this is where Jesus becomes offensive to right on Christian progressives, right? Because what the early Christians did, and the Apostle Paul does the same thing. First Peter does it as well. The early Christian imagination seemed to be something that I call benign indifference. That they seemed benignly indifferent to the things that everyone else around them was absolutely obsessed with. So, and usually from a political point of view. So that whole thing about taxes, for example, was, of course, it was the tax, Caesar's tax, that they asked Jesus, should we pay it or not? It was a tax imposed by Caesar on the Jews as a racial insult. It was like his way of it was actually to pay for the temples. It was like Caesar saying, you think you're so special, you chosen people. Well, you have to pay me for the right to worship in your own temple. Take that, Jews. And this was seen as like a racial insult. And it wasn't. So when the Pharisees come to Jesus and say, should we pay the tax? They're not asking, should we pay municipal taxes? They're asking, should we participate in this racial insult? And Jesus says, yes. Right? And he says, yeah, pay it. It's only money. We've got bigger things to worry about, effectively. And you see that same attitude happen in Paul. He does that in Romans 13, by the way, which you can listen to. I do a whole episode on that. But, often a lot of the things that people sort of stand in absolute slack-jawed sort of wonder at, Jesus and the others just bypass. And they don't even attack it. They just don't really care about it. And I find that interesting because that itself is what led to some of the big changes. So a lot of social changes don't come because the early Christians threw all their might against it. It came because they just didn't care and they just get on with doing what they wanted to do anyway. A good example would be the idea of infant exposure. I've talked about this before in other places, but infant exposure, of course, is the practice that you leave unwanted babies out to die. In Rome, the Roman society, this was a moral practice. This was perfectly common sense. It was the right thing to do. It wasn't a grubby, shameful act. The right thing to do is if you had an unwanted child that you couldn't support, you needed to leave them out to the elements to die, because otherwise there'd be too many mouths to feed and too many humans walking around. It just is bad for the society. And obviously a lot of the unwanted children were actually girls. So leaving unwanted girls out to die was the right thing to do. And so the early Christians, we're talking sort of the first 100 years of Christianity, what did they do? Did they all get together and organize themselves? Oh, this is awful. We got to mobilize to change the laws. We need to engage in culture wars to affect the hearts and minds of Roman society. Or we need to get our people into positions of power, even if it means compromising, so that one day they can change, the law to make infant exposure illegal. No. What they did was they just went and brought these girl babies in anyway. They just did it. And it was offensive, and it was immoral, and it was annoying. And by the way, 12, 15 years later, all these women are walking around that should have died, and they were negatively affecting the Roman economy. Like, the Christians didn't win any sort of culture war. They didn't win the hearts and minds of anybody. But all of a sudden, there's all these human women walking around, and Roman society had to adapt. It had to change. And it did. And actually, eventually, one of the things that happened was the word person started to become applied to girl babies. Whereas before, under Roman law, it was only applied to men, Roman citizen males with a certain amount of land. Under Roman law, they were persons. And one of the things the Christians started doing, they just started using that word person indiscriminately to apply to all sorts of people, including girl babies. And it started to affect Roman law.
Would the same thing work today, do you think? I mean, obviously different
Well, I think
but
I think it's
same
I think
methods.
it's yeah. Oh, I mean, yes is my short answer. And even if it doesn't work, it's still the Christian way to do it, right? So I don't actually think a thing is right or wrong to do, whether it works or not. So, like, along with Stanley Hauerwas, he says, I don't practice nonviolence because it works. I practice nonviolence because Jesus asked me to. And so, I think any attempt to dominate society, to ram your agenda through the system, to compromise, in order to get power, that's just a non-Christ-like way to be. And so it's just not the way we do things, even if it works, air quotes. You might win the world but lose your soul, which is what happens. It's happened to American Christian evangelicals now. I mean, look at that. And so I do think there's something to be said for that. But also, it also kind of works. I mean, you can see, I don't know, the way Christians deal with Down syndrome babies, like my dear friends who have Down syndrome children, and they decided not to abort them. And they say, we don't care. Everybody's telling them you should abort this baby. And the Christians are like, no, we're just going to have, your life will be miserable. We don't care. It's going to negatively affect the economy. We don't care. And they just do it. And by doing that, they are affecting the world around them. Even if the laws never change, they've still done something political by bringing a human being into the world that everyone else thinks should have died. And that's an example, and I see that happening more than once in the world that I live in. So
I think there's the example of going and fetching the girl babies left to infant exposure is, I think, a beautiful example. And I love the example of Christians not aborting their Down syndrome babies. But I think the early church example is better because it doesn't feel as passive and as we're all right in this little group, which again is that core problem that leads to nationalism, patriotism, is whatever happens outside of this, we don't care about. You see this in the kind of malignant indifference of first world countries.
Yeah, there's a malignant indifference, for sure.
Yeah. And I think that's fine for a small community that doesn't have much influence. And you can understand why pragmatically they couldn't go out and, try and stop the practice or whatever because of it wouldn't have done anything. And maybe that's not the reason why they didn't. But in other things, in things that the Bible seems weirdly silent on, and Jesus and Paul seem weirdly silent on, the injustice of slavery, which to us is abhorrent, and which was ended because of some Christian convictions. At least that's the narrative that we use. And I think correctly that those are Christian convictions. Is there an argument to be said in a way that Hauerwas may not agree with, that actually there are times when we must make every effort to impose not our will, but change on a society so that people don't suffer, rather than going, well, as long as we don't cause the suffering, it's fine. Like, I don't think it matters to the people who are suffering. It's not enough to go, I am not going to rob anybody on the road. You have to be a neighbor to the person who has been robbed. Right. I know that in the story they don't go out and track down the robbers Taken style. Yeah. but isn't it privilege of a kind of malignant indifference to go, we're going to do it differently, but hey, what you guys do, it really doesn't matter, and you're letting the weak suffer under the oppressed? Because I like later Christianity for its Martin Luther King Jr.'s.
Well, I'm kind of aware of broad is the way that leads to destruction, but narrow is the way that leads to life. Which isn't actually about like eternal damnation or eternal heavenly salvation. It's about Jesus is saying, like, look around the world right now as it's living. Look at the way people are grasping for power and dominating over each other and going about their business. It's destruction, isn't it? Broad is the way that leads to destruction. Narrow is the way that leads to life. form yourself around me in my way, and this is life-giving. So a lot of the language, even in the New Testament, is not one of personal salvation. It's not an inner individual salvation. It's one of, this is as we move together through this world, we are living the way of life. So it's a movement of wanting people to join you as well. So it's not being passive. When you say, like, this is how we deal with evil, it's not saying we don't want to have anything to deal with evil at all. It's saying, well, we recognize that actually, well, like, for example, okay, you brought up the idea of people dying on robbers on the road, right? It is actually well known that when a police force shows up in a place of tension, violence will ensue, right? And like, so it's looking at and going, actually, bringing violence into a violent situation doesn't actually solve the violence. Imagine
I'm not talking
that.
about bringing violence in. I'm talking about bringing an active participation.
Right.
You don't have to send the police, but you could send something.
Right. And so you send a witness, or you send a servant, or you do something, but you're not just fighting with the world's weapons, right? And the world will look at you and go, oh, you're not fighting the way we fight, therefore you don't care. And the Christian will be like, no, we care. We just don't fight with the way you're fighting, because, by the way, your way is leading to destruction.
We had an interesting conversation in, I think it's the last episode that we released. I may be incorrect because I have not been catching our own episodes. But
you don't listen to our podcast. You listen to Stephen's podcast. You don't listen to our podcast.
Yeah, I listen to some of our podcasts.
Just your parts. You just listen to your voice.
That's my good bit. Yeah, no, we had an interesting kind of thought about, because so the episode I talk about is when I went to the September Rebellion, with the Extinction Rebellion, and didn't get arrested, but was kind of with people who were getting arrested. I think that's kind of interesting. Kind of thing of what we're talking about is whether, I think something we kind of touched on is, do we as Christians, should we be getting arrested? Like, are we being actually physically called to be getting arrested in these kind of situations because we're fighting for justice in that way, or is it better to stand back? So I think that's kind of
so when I talk about benign indifference, I'm actually not talking about benign indifference to the plight of the poor. I'm talking about benign indifference to our own comfort and our own rights, right? So one of the main things Jesus does is it basically comes down to, he says, don't clutch tightly to what is rightfully yours, even when it's rightfully yours. That's basically the way to sum up pretty much everything Jesus teaches when it comes to turn the other cheek, or pay the tax to Caesar, or when somebody sues you for a coat, give them your cloak as well, or go the extra mile. It's basically, don't clutch tightly to what is rightfully yours, even when it's rightfully yours, right? And so, privileged Christians, I'm a privileged Christian, and I'm supposed to treat my privilege with a benign indifference. I hold it with an open hand. And so for me, like, getting arrested in a protest against the state is a far more Christ-like way to show my engagement with society than joining the armed police force in order to dominate the rule of the state over the people. Whereas a lot of Christians, especially in America right now, they're all law and order, and they think that the Christian way, this is why Donald Trump can hold up a Bible in front of a church and talk about law and order, because these people worship power. They worship domination. They worship law and order. And they think that obeying the law is the same as being good. Whereas followers of Jesus recognize that sometimes disobeying the law or being hurt by the law is being good will get you hurt by the law. And, they're not clutching tightly to their own rights to stay within the law. They're realizing they can give that up.
So when Jesus is asked about the unjust tax on the Jews, he's responding as a Jew, right? And he's saying, we Jews shouldn't be so concerned with this. It's not the same as him being asked about another group that's being persecuted.
He's talking about himself. Yeah, exactly. And what he's doing is it's actually a re-education campaign, because the Messiah was the Braveheart type figure that everyone wanted. They wanted Yeah, you'll like this, Malky. You know, they wanted the Braveheart. They wanted the nationalist folk hero who was going to kick the foreigners out, right? That's what they wanted. And so when they come to Jesus and going, what do you think about this tax? That tax was the catalyst for all sorts of nationalist uprisings. Jewish freedom fighters would fight about this tax. And they're asking Jesus, are you one of these people? Should we be following you or not? And so when Jesus says pay the tax, he's essentially saying, love your enemies. We're doing something different. Our revolution looks different. Because, by the way, rising up to kick out the evil ruling empire doesn't actually solve violence, and it doesn't really do much anyway, actually. Maybe in the short term. But if you let go of nationalism, and if you think all human beings are actually equal, then you're not allowed to say, well, my group won that round, so it was the right thing to do. What you look at, if you step back and you go, all we're seeing is one group of humans killing another group of humans, and the border is just changing shape a little bit. But the violence has not been solved at all. Nothing's been solved. And so Jesus' response was, we're not going to do that. We're not going to get involved in freedom fighting in order to fight injustice. Even though it was unjust, he recognizes that, I think. Nobody would disagree. But we're going to do it differently, you know. And he healed Roman children and servants. And he ate with tax collectors who were committing race traitor actions by collecting taxes. So he showed his resistance to the different powers that be through fellowship and healing. But he did resist them. I mean, he was killed by them, right? Like, he was still an enemy. This is the thing. When they looked at Jesus, when Rome looked at Jesus, they didn't see some benign figure tottering around saying, wouldn't it be nice if everyone loved each other? They saw a king of the Jews. They saw somebody who had the command of thousands of people who were following him. And they were swarming over the hillsides to be with him. And they were shouting his name as he went into Jerusalem. So Rome and the high priest class, they saw in Jesus like a legitimate ruler with claims to being the ruler. And he was doing it without violence. So that's, you know, he wasn't an anonymous little figure trotting around the countryside with 12 men behind him. He was the leader of a huge movement that was destabilizing the region. And he was doing it through healing and loving and, you know, hanging out with women and children. So
he was doing all these things that were offensive to the ruling powers, and then, like you say, healing and hanging out with members of it. It's kind of like being a leader of a progressive movement in the States now and going, sure, some of my friends are Trump supporters. You know, I think they're wrong, but they're, you know, it's a kind of scandalous to both sides, but probably to different degrees kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah. I don't hang out with kind of progressive sides that much because my interest is mostly on patriotism, so that tends to not attract. I tend not to talk too much to the lefty progressives, although they've got their own issues with tribalism and you know, this rolling my eyes, the cancel culture. I know that's a cliche, but like the idea that you don't sound like us, you're not saying the right things, you don't look like us, you're out, you're dead to me. You know, that is the exact same impulse that I'm talking about when it comes to nationalism, I think.
Yeah. And your earlier description of a multicultural nationalism that's united around a flag and a set of values, then actually that fits very nicely with a kind of, malicious unity.
Malicious unity, that's good. I like that phrase.
Also sounds like a grindcore band, which is
malicious unity. Yeah, I liked them when I was in high school. Malicious unity. You know, but like that would be the kind of thing maybe your audience is more susceptible to the temptation of malicious unity than jingoistic patriotism. But
it's just another form of exclusivism, eh?
Yeah, and dehumanizing. It's basically trying to determine who's no longer a human to you.
Yeah.
It's an inhuman kind of way of saying, you're not real to me anymore. And Stephen, I think that's something we have to watch out for, right?
we are coming to the end of all time. And I just wanted to let you know, no, to the other podcast. The eschaton. We have immanentized it fully now, and we're here. Thanks so much for being on the podcast. Before we go, we have to ask you what you've been drinking. I
haven't been drinking while talking to you, but I do enjoy a hoppy beer. I like the hoppier the better. If I can go for something that tastes like a grapefruit, then I'm happy.
Excellent. Fantastic. What about you, Laura and Melky? What you've been drinking?
I have been back on the old faithful Jack Daniels and Coke. Ran down to the newsagents, grabbed a few tinnies. It's been great.
My life has somewhat been transformed by finding. I've been working my way through the non-alcoholic beers. Hoegaarden. It's got loads of A's in it.
Yeah,
as a word.
Hoegaarden.
That's the one. But it's like a wheat beer.
Yeah.
And now you're going to take the piss out of me for saying wheat.
Wheat, because you're Scottish and you say wheat. I'm so torn between making a joke about the wheat beer or being in a Hoegaarden. One of my favourite places.
But anyway, it's awesome. Like wheat beers that are non-alcoholic, they work real good.
It's a revelation.
I drank a really classy tin of Streetcar Named Desire, aka Stella, and a non-alcoholic, what is this thing called? Heineken. So there you go. Thanks for listening to Beer Christianity. Thank you, Stephen, so much for coming. Sorry, I called you Stephen again. I meant James. So much for coming to Beer Christianity. If you want to find out more Beer Christianity, you can get us at beerchristianity.libsyn.com. You can find us on Twitter, Beerxianity, and if you want to email us, beerchristianity@yahoo.com, because we old school. Tune in again soon, and thanks again, Stephen.
Bye. Bye.